Thank you very much, Lucas, for that wonderful introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be here tonight. Can everyone hear me well? Yep. What a delight to be speaking to Edwin about this magnificent book and about his life in publishing. So here it is, 420 pages.
Could have been longer.
It could have been longer. And the extraordinary thing, of course, about a book like this is that it's 420 pages, but in some ways, because each chapter is as dense as an atom, right? It's like 42,000 pages, because you'll alight on a chapter on Virginia Woolf or Vasily Grossman, and you'll have selected one book, as is the format of your quasi-history, but you'll also range across the entire body of work by that author, and also, of course, spread out to many other works too. It's really just a book about literature and about the novel. So it's sort of hard to know where to begin, but I thought I would begin teasingly.
All right.
Which is, you have this, there's a lovely chapter, or half chapter, I guess, on Jean Rhys, a writer we both love. And you're talking about the Jean Rhys heroine, this woman who appears in the 4 novels that she wrote in the late 20s and 1930s. And you talk about how there's a sense in those characters in characters' lives that I guess they could have gone a different way, but they didn't. They've ended up the way they did. And you've put it like this. It's a lovely phrase. There is a 19th century novel in everybody's life, which I really liked. The normal formulation is everyone's got a novel in them, a novel to write.
Yeah.
But you sort of turn it around, which is we all have a novel inside us that might be a different novel playing out, or we have an idea of how our life could have been in a different context. So, and I also like the way in which it measures a certain narrowness. These are small novels compared to, say, the 19th century bigness. It measures a difference, I think, between the 20th and 19th century novel. So I just thought it would be a way, there's a 19th century novel in everybody's life. I thought that would be just a nice way of beginning the discussion, essentially to ask you what is, or what was, the 19th century novel, against which the 20th century novel that is your subject in this book is playing out.
Well, it's interesting because with Rhys, those novels are so slim, and they are almost, you could almost see them as starved, and the heroines are, in a way, starving for love, but at the same time they're absolutely intransigent and determined. So they're a funny mixture of being in a kind of 1920s way, and they're mostly written in the 20s. The one, Good Morning Midnight, is written in the 30s, but they have a kind of sleek, tight 20th century fashionable profile as opposed to bustles and what you will if you're talking about women's dress and that. And both author and her characters are conscious of throwing over a world of, well, I don't want to limit the 19th century too much. It's a bit of a parody of the 19th century, in the 19th century novel, but a world of bourgeois accommodation, of balancing, of thinking about what your claims are, but also thinking about really you should acknowledge the larger, social interest and bear with it and bear up under it if it is a bit of a burden, because that would be your duty. And in various ways, the 19th century novel, with tremendous exceptions, but well, the most obvious one, the two obvious ones are perhaps Jane Austen and Sense and Sensibility. I talk about who's very, the title sets the term, sense of, making do and figuring out where your position in the world is, sensibility, used in that case, in Austen's sense as an alertness to your own feelings, a kind of interior, and Trollope, in a way, makes a career of writing novels where these things are worked out.
Yeah.
And that is not going to be the kind of novel that the novelists I look at write, though it remains, these are real concerns for any of us. I mean, balancing the claims of self and society, balancing the way we see the world and the world sees us. It's not as if those claims disappear, but the writers I'm writing about basically usually want to press the case for one side or the other, and most of them want to press the case for the self, because a major difference between the novel of the 20th century is just the sheer proliferation of the first person.
Right. So we have this 19th century form, which is, as you say, and as we both acknowledge, is multifarious anyway and difficult to. Not monolithic, difficult to talk about in summary. But we have this form that is premised on, should we say, intelligibility, for sure, that often, whose form often has a terminal quality, or in the sense, of a terminus, like something closes, a marriage settlement, or life goes on, after the pages of the novel are finished, into which comes, and you use the word balance, I think, about the 19th century novel, into which comes this great anarchic bomb thrower, Dostoevsky. Your choice for the first 20th century novel, even though Notes from Underground, the book that you're talking about, was published in 1864. Just talk a little bit about that amazing book and your choice for it at the beginning of yours.
It's interesting. Dostoevsky's influence is probably registered not directly through that book, and so in a way, it's Crime and Punishment, and so on, translated around the world, starting in the 1880s and an ongoing basis. I think even in the 20s, the excerpt Stavrogin's Confession, which is in some ways a key story for Lolita later, is translated by Lawrence, and I now can't remember his Russian. Anyway, Dostoevsky in various ways becomes a presence who just keeps cropping up, and there are people like, Borges and despises the Dostoevsky and psychological novel. It's just, it's just this terrible stuff, that's going on, and making every novel unreadable because of all the people's mixed motives, and who cares?
Right.
But anyway, that in itself is a way of saying that what, in a way, you find in Notes from the Underground, which is a character whose motives are overwhelmingly conflicted within himself and with relationship to the world outside of him too. So it's extremely hard to find exactly, and Dostoevsky makes it as hard as it possibly can be, to figure out what exactly are the grounds on which he's acting and what are the grounds on which we're to evaluate this other person as a person.
Right.
So in various ways that becomes an interesting proposition, because one of the things we do go to novels to do is to try and figure out our fellow human beings. They are, they're shown to us in certain ways, and we think that, people act like that, and I like people who act like that, I don't like people who act like that, but I can now understand why those people act like that, and so on. But this character curiously frustrates that desire to take a measure, and all the more because the character is both presented as deplorable and at the same time as in some sense a tribune or somebody who is actually, or a siren, kind of calling out and saying what's wrong with our larger world.
Yes.
So the very figure that we would hope to make sense of things around us actually actively confuses us.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think of a book that is, and in this way, it's a way in which the novel perhaps stands out from philosophy can be confusing and dense, but philosophy doesn't actually, in principle, is not trying to confuse us. It's trying to resolve our confusions. Right. But here a novel is presented as something which is making a pitch to really make us less certain of what we know.
Yeah. And also in a way that I think you're interested in and that seems very contemporary and very 20th century. This is a book, Notes from Underground, whose narrator both leans on literature and wants to get beyond it. Yeah. Right? It's sort of sentimentally attached to literature and sometimes says, I'm copying this out of Gogol or whatever it is. But who also at the end of the book says, this isn't, don't mistake this for literature. This is notes. I'm doing something. Mm-hmm. And doing something what? Doing something more real than literature? What's the motion there that interests you?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, at one level, in terms of the sort of larger historical framework of the work, one of my interests is the rise of the novel. Yeah. Which, I mean, I'm very much interested in the modern bourgeois novel. There are people who've made strong cases that this shouldn't be separated from all the other long prose fiction narratives that have existed in various forms through the ages in various countries, but I think it is a different kind of thing, but starting really in the 18th century and so on. But it is a popular form from the beginning, but not actually a particularly esteemed form. And there's, in Notes from Underground, you have somebody both in a country which had very few novels at the time that this book was being written. I mean, there were, I don't know, when Dostoevsky wrote his first novel in Russian, I think there was something like, I'm very bad at numbers, but something like 35 Russian novels that existed. Right. Novels existed from elsewhere. Is in a way a tribute to the authority of literature, to the fact that literature is in some sense reshaping perceptions of life, but equally to the sense that authority, much of it is sentimental, much of it is misguided, much of it is not doing what it needs to do to actually make us more alert and aware to life, and not doing what it makes us more alert and aware to the page in terms of how words are put together to try and make a novel which actually, and this for Russia is as a sort of cliche metaphor, is a legitimate enough one, rattle the bars. Right. Because he's writing in a country where there are all sorts of impediments to talking about what's going on in the country, and himself has come through an experience of being sent to a prison camp for 7 years, based on not on what he had written before, but on his political engagements. Yeah.
Go back to the thing of getting beyond literature. Mm. You and I had a drink before this event. We probably shouldn't have done. No, I didn't mean it that way. We're totally coherent. Thank you very much. I meant that we made the mistake of already having a chat or two about the book before the event, and you said something very striking, which was that in some ways, despite a certain reputation that the 20th century modernist and postmodern novel has, and you certainly write brilliantly about that, and it would be the reputation that these texts are self-reflexive, they're suspicious about themselves, they question their validity and their status and so on. They're written in modes of rebellion against realism, or against realism. You said, actually, you're struck by how the ways in which the 20th century novel is more real than the 19th century novel. And I just wondered if you'd talk a bit about that. Because it seems to come out of this thing of the man from the underground saying, I'm not right, don't mistake this for literature. I'm not writing literature. These are just some notes I've cast down. That's a gesture which we see, of course, again and again in the novel, even when it's, as you say, when it's making its supposedly officially anti-realist mode. It's a gesture that's made in the name of the real, of greater life, more life. Mm-hmm.
Well, and not being a novel in some sense.
Yeah.
You think this is a novel, this is not a novel. And the interesting claim is that it's actually an interesting novel because it is not a novel of the sort you're... Yep. So, I mean, part of that is this endless anxiety, especially as the novel does in fact ascend in esteem amongst people, about being a mere commodity. Because the novel is a commodity. Frankly, the novel is an industrial product which requires enough of a literate population and enough of a distribution system to make it worthwhile for somebody to sit down and spend all that time writing it. And above and beyond that, somebody to actually invest the money in printing and producing it and getting it out to the world, because it's an expensive proposition in time and so on. And but yeah, it was an early, I mean, one of the places where I began was a strong sense that the notion that the 20th century novel was a triumph of abstraction, of high artifice, and so on, was frankly completely wrong. Right. I mean, there's nothing, I mean, Joyce's Ulysses is, in many ways, the sentences are not always don't immediately make sense, but it's crammed with, as the philosopher would say, realia, things, all the stuff of the world is there. Yeah. And he would have liked to put more stuff of the world there. And he also has an awareness, which is actually a very realistic awareness, that words and the forms in which we cast words are real influences on how we work, how we act in the world. Yes. And so both so there's a will to see the things, I think I say somewhere, the realities of boudoir and abattoir and so on, which were politely swept under the carpet by the 19th century novel, especially the English 19th century novel, to bring those out in the open in books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Yeah. And then there are, what's going on in the world that we haven't talked about that really is out there, and to the extent that the 19th century novel is realistic, we are going to be that much more realistic. Yeah. And then there's an awareness of all the different uses of language that both exist and actually could exist, and could in fact transform our perception of both the world and of the words we use to describe the world we exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking as you're talking about Joyce, there is that sort of problem with anti-realist arguments, which is everything is real. Everything is real, right? Words are real.
They are.
And the fact that words speak us is a reality. Yeah. Here are some, I'm going to just read out a few really wonderful and provocative things that you say, and we'll just see what we have as a sort of anthology of if something is coalescing here. At the end of your terrific chapter on the Magic Mountain, you write that it's an immense book that is also, in a sense, an empty book. That's a big, bold statement to make about that novel. About Ulysses, you say, in a profound sense, you say like a day, like a language, like a person, in a profound sense, it's meaningless. You talk about Nabokov's Lolita as short-circuiting the connection between ethics and aesthetics. You talk about Robert Musil's character Ulrich as a believer, or he himself, I think, says about himself that he's a believer who doesn't believe in anything. And then we might add, say, Kafka, whose sentences go on, in whose world a door opens and, you find that there's nothing behind the door, or it's not a door that there's a bed up against the door because so if we put all that together, a very large, magnificent book that wins Thomas Mann the Nobel Prize is in a sense an empty book. Ulysses, in a sense, meaningless. The hero of The Man Without Qualities is a believer who doesn't have anything to believe in. What's being described here?
It's funny. I also think of another sentence I have in there, which is that, in passing, how odd it is that Proust's In Search of Lost Time and Ulysses and The Magic Mountain are all enclosed, sort of like a fortune cookie, a single message: love is all there is. But which is itself a phrase which is both embracing, but in a curious sense, everything it stands to be proven in a way, so that there's a way in which it's empty too, like perhaps all.
Right.
I mean, with Joyce, I was particularly concerned with the way in which, frankly, I first read Joyce, which was thinking that I had to sort of, puzzle it out, and somehow it was a giant, it was encrypted.
Right.
And you had to know every corner of Dublin and every allusion to what you will, of which there are endless ones in. But I think that the central action of the book is very simply two men wandering around a city and noticing some things themselves and not noticing other things themselves.
Yeah.
And they're in the company of a writer who is also noticing things, and at a certain point actually becomes less interested in the action of those two men going around, but that it is in fact a kind of written space which Joyce would like to have been as big as life.
Yeah.
And it does not matter. There is not finally something it all adds up to, other than being the thing it is, in which there are the things that you, the reader, can move from this to that. And notice notice and absorb what you do, and come back if you wish, and notice and absorb other things as well as the things you noticed before, and that the invitation of the book is an essentially generous one to live in this written space, which is in some sense analogous to the lived space of our lives. The Mann book is a little different in that there is an effort to kind of go systematic. I mean, it's interesting how probably Mann had some idea of what Ulysses was going on. He's writing slightly after Ulysses, but I don't think that Mann is influenced by emulation. Mann, in some sense, is much more than Joyce, is interested in going through a whole sequence of ways of human knowing to say, and each of them, in some sense, his character, a very ordinary man, finds deficient at a certain level because love is all there is in the end, but that, though in fact he goes off to war and may well die at the end because in fact the world, the fortune cookie does not predict the fortunes of the world.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would be possible to say about Middlemarch, say, that you couldn't say in a profound sense it's meaningless, and you also couldn't say it's an immense book that's also, in a sense, an empty book, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Middlemarch does want to make a point and wants to give you something to... And I bring in Middlemarch late in the book as a contrast to the books I've been talking about.
Yeah.
And say that, and it struck me sort of late in my writing of this book, which I hope is a kind of ongoing thinking about what these books can be, which actually changes as you turn it from one angle to another, that there is a kind of, that in some sense the 20th century novel is a case for the heroic. It is in a dangerous time, in a time that threatens people in all sorts of ways. Even some of the opportunities of the century are threatening. These are the heroes and heroines of the novel, including the heroines of Jean Rhys, are people of a stubborn and indomitable determination.
Yes.
Whereas Dorothea Brooke actually has to have the heroism taken out of her. It has to be normal so that we all know that the thing she has learned is something that we might well learn, so that we can exist in a kind of common world of common understanding.
Yeah.
Those common understandings are hard to come by in the novels I'm talking about.
Yeah, so that was what I was going to ask you, because that's a wonderful bit in your book towards the end where you say maybe the sort of secret at the heart, the secret history at the heart of the 20th century novel is that it wants to discover and affirm heroism. Mm-hmm. You then go on to say, but it's not clear what those heroes and heroines believe in. And I guess that might be a difference that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a problem. I mean, there is a certain kind of going back to the underground man, a kind of let me stand up for my pure raw sensibility.
Right.
Well, we all understand that inclination, and we can, and we all might balk at being finally brought round or reined in as much as Dorothea Brooke is at the end of Middlemarch. But on the other hand, it is true that many of these characters, and especially a writer I don't write about, who I think is it's a sort of omission, but an amazing and notorious, in some ways distinctly deplorable figure in the 20th century novel, Celine. But a brilliant innovator is a person who really lacks any kind of sense of moral compass except outrage. But then it's a century where the expression of outrage seems, there seems to be good reason for it.
Yeah. You could say about the 19th and 20th century novel that that in some ways the 19th century novel is slow to catch up with, formally, it's sort of slow to catch up with 19th century philosophy, that the forms keep on, they last a bit longer, and they encode, in terms of, let's say, settlement, closure, stability, they encode a certain order. And then, say after the First World War, that's not possible anymore. And the forms explode, and there's a period of intense ferment and originality, in which the novelistic forms are just tremendously open.
Yeah, I think actually...
Is that right?
I think it's an interesting feature that actually the explosion of the forms really takes place before the war, and in that sense is somewhat motivated by the increasing seriousness of the Victorian novel, and during the Victorian era, well, both the increasing popularity of the novel and in some sense the trivialization of it, but also the sense that the novel could be a great form and that it was a new form. It was a different form from the epic poem, which very few people, Charles Doughty is trying to write one, but nobody's sitting around trying to write an epic poem again at this point, and in a way, we're all grateful for it.
Along with ballads.
But there is the sense that wait, the novel actually is something quite remarkable that has emerged in our midst. And so you have James beginning to take it very seriously. You have issues of form that you discuss in your book about fiction, by coming through Flaubert and so on, a growing formal. So in some sense, the actual formal breakage really occurs in the 20 years before the First World War, and the books that we think of as being these sort of monumental figures the monuments of 20th century novel, which is again In Search of Lost Time, The Magic Mountain, and Ulysses, are books both looking back to that time, and they are books about that time in many ways, and books emerging from that time, as in fact Cubism and so on do. So there's a way in which the break with Victorianism actually emerges from the Victorian moment of saying, what exactly are we doing? And we must take ourselves, as George Eliot might say, we must be quite serious about what we're doing.
And that would probably explain why I think we're still about 240 pages into your book at the point where you're talking about D.H. Lawrence. And Sons and Lovers and the Rainbow, which is 1911, 1915. 240 pages into a book about the 20th century novel. I mean, I love that. I bring it on. But I noted it.
And it's an anachronism because I sort of jump back to, I mean, I've already talked about Rees and Woolf and the novels of the 20s, and I'm just before talking about the Second World War, really, that I talk about Lawrence, partly as an exception to the things I've been talking about, though as also in some sense as a concentration of some of the things that I've been talking about.
Well, speaking of Lawrence, and it's nice just to sort of rest on an individual writer or two, because the book's so big that there's so many writers. But speaking of Lawrence, part of the difficulty about writing any kind of, I know you're not writing a formal history, but anything that touches on development and shape, and here's this and then that and then that. One, by the way, that Virginia Woolf cannot resolve in A Room of One's Own, which is, what do you do with individual weird genius, right? In Woolf's case, she's constantly, you can see her, she's constantly having to deal with the fact that Jane Austen sort of came out of nowhere. And she won't deal with the fact that George Eliot came out of nowhere. She literally ignores George Eliot in A Room of One's Own. But Austen, she knows she must do something with Austen, but it doesn't make any sense because Austen seems to have just been there in some way. And I felt for your book that similarly, Lawrence is just one of those, right? What are the forms exactly of Lawrence's novels, right? What's the shape? They could have. There's some way in which, and you can read Lawrence's travel writing and his fiction, and his essays. I put them all together really. I just read him in a continuum, and it's all driven by Lawrence's open-ended quest for meaning and to use writing for meaning, and in the sense of the sort of the 20th century, he happens to belong quite early, in fact, to it.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been that weird if he'd been writing in the late 30s or maybe in the late 40s.
Yeah.
So how do you? It's just hard to. The reason I wrote How Fiction Works in little paragraphs is that I knew that I couldn't do this sort of thing, of what you're doing. I couldn't make any.
I can't, many times I thought I can't either.
I just didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I mean, Lawrence was interesting coming back to, because I knew I would go back to Lawrence, but that was partly on the base. I had not read Lawrence's novels for a very, very long time, really since I was a teenager and then maybe a bit in my 20s.
Yeah.
I had read a good deal of the poetry, and I'd come to think ever more highly of the poetry. I mean, the poetry he is one of the great English poets of the 20th century.
Build the Ship of Death. So beautiful.
A truly beautiful poem. So I felt I had to reread him, and I went back to Sons and Lovers with the memory of my own adolescent self, the same age as Paul Morell, thinking that this was a sort of shallow book. And I knew much better about being what it was to be 16 or 17 than D.H. Lawrence did.
Right.
And sat down and was just astonished. I mean, in the way that one isn't all that often by a book. And even less so perhaps by a book on second reading, though it helps if you read it when you were callow and ignorant.
Yeah.
But, and so of course I was, fascinated. I could see the connections with the poetry, I could see the connections to the, and I then went on to read the books that I had read back in the day over a number of, The Rainbow and Women in Love, and saw a quite extraordinary St. Maur or two, a number of other.
I love St. Maur.
Yeah. But with those three big novels of the teens, a kind of progression from doing a novel, about a Bildungsroman, a novel about growing up, though it's not quite that, to a family novel, which has a more collective sort of sense of self, and which is also just another way of thinking about human experience. And Lawrence's initial publisher turns down The Rainbow because Garnett does not get what he's doing, and Lawrence in his, Lawrence was pretty, couldn't be deterred anyway, but fearless in his way. Writes that, and then Women in Love, which I remembered, and I think many people may remember, sort of Lawrence Birkin as kind of a blustering person, sort of arguing. But it's actually a social novel. It's a novel of society with the Adeline moral kind of picture, and a rethinking of what the social novel would be. And you have, between those three books, basically a rethinking of all the dimensions of the 19th century novel, the social novel, the individual novel, the family novel, in a way that is, it raises your hackles, but is unbelievably inventive and an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, The End of the Rainbow, absolutely brilliant. I mean, refuses it's not the marriage thing. It's proto-feminist, in fact. It's Ursula going off against her father's wishes to go down south and try her hand as a school teacher.
Yeah.
It's marvelous. In a way, it's a sort of almost like an English version of Buddenbrooks. It's like the third generation is going to do something weird and difficult and rebellious. I'm also struck by Lawrence's wonderful simplicity, actually, when he wants to. You know, we think of Lawrence as just the repetitive rhetoric and so on. But a line that you and I both love, and I wrote it down, is when Tom drunkenly comes back from the town and drowns. I mean, he just walks into the pond and trips, and suddenly he's dying. And Lawrence's line is, "A great wonder of anguish went over him, then the blackness covered him entirely." A great wonder of anguish went over him, then the blackness covered him entirely. I could keep on talking, but there are questions from the audience, but before that, I just want to get on to publishing too, and your extraordinary 25 years. I bet everyone in the audience has a favorite weird book that you have published and that one is eternally grateful for. Mine, although I didn't discover it myself, it was actually given to me by my friend Susanna Kazin, who wrote Girl Interrupted. So she knows a thing or two about memoirs. She said, I'm reading this crazy memoir by an American who married a Hungarian baron and had to go and live in his castle. And I said, send it over. So she dropped it off one day in Cambridge. It's called More Was Lost by Eleanor Pereny. But we've all got our things to be grateful for in this fabulous list. And I suppose one question I have is how do you get hold of the more elusive stuff that you might be reprinting, like Pereny's memoir? I mean, what are the mechanisms by which you get? Are you continually scouting? Or how do you?
Well, I mean, I should say that I have wonderful colleagues who helped to find these books as well. And in that case, my colleague Susan Barba was the advocate for the book. And I don't know where Susan had read it before. And I had some vague knowledge of it, but I certainly hadn't read it. But it is an extraordinary account of an American woman of the 20s showing up in
she goes to a dinner party in Budapest, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and showing up on a huge estate, crumbling estate, and one of these, and trying to make some sense of it. And then it's bookended by the breakout of war again. I mean, for me, it was recommended the book a kind of fascinating. I mean, it in this way connects to some extent with this book. All the odd left forgotten spaces, which actually were finally mostly not to be forgotten, but to be swept up in the larger disruption of the last century. But it is a world. It is two. What is it? One world struggling to be, one word dying, and the other struggling to be born, which I think is Matthew Arnold and so on. But it is a chronicle of that kind of and a very, very well. It has a novelistic interest without falling prey to novelistic stylings, the way in which people's memoirs are too often.
Absolutely beautifully written. It's very cinematically written, actually. I mean, she goes to a dinner party in Budapest with her mum, and sits next to, I think, the Hungarian aristocrat who doesn't have any money. They fall in love, and the scene I remember that's very filmic is he says, "Well, if you're marrying me, then you'll have to come to the old crumbling castle." Well, he's not Hungarian. Is he Hungarian? Yes, he is Hungarian.
He's Hungarian. Yeah. No, and
and so,
but
on the edge of the Carpathians,
on the other side of the Czechoslovak border, or something like that, right?
Anyways,
because they have to sort of almost creep over the fences,
right?
And
but he says you'll
finally
have to
get into the.
You'll have to come you'll have to come to get to know the house, and as she turns up at the house, so as in a film, so all the retainers and servants are waiting to receive her. But no, I mean these extraordinary books that you've published, and of course now you're doing quite a lot of contemporary writing too. I've written about Gwendolyn Riley. You did that marvelous book by Susie Boyd. You had the great success of Joshua Cohen's The Netanyahus, which I bet you didn't think would win the Pulitzer Prize.
I did not. I mean, a colleague said something about, what amazing news. And I wasn't even paying attention to the Pulitzer Prize. So
Yeah, and I'm right to say, am I not, that was a novel that was turned down by many people.
Yeah.
I mean, more than 10 publishers. But it came your way and you read it and said...
Yeah, I mean, I read it and I thought it was a tour de force which was concentrated and finally an interesting novel about questions that are preoccupying questions of our day, the questions of identity and how it's conceived and so on.
Yeah.
Done with, light touch doesn't quite describe the book, but it keeps shifting its perspective on those questions within fairly narrow constraints, and it keeps moving around. And that was something that I guess I would admire in a novel, not the sense that you just have a carpet that's just it's rolled out so far, and then it's going to roll out a little farther, and it's going to roll out farther, and eventually you're going to be at the end. But a sense that, you got this far, and then suddenly things look a little bit different, and so on. And that, I think Josh's book has that.
Yes. Whether your life will be harder going forward than it has been, I think is an open question. You have a nice line about how the difference between online reading and book reading. You say online reading is more like hunting and gathering, and less like agriculture.
As everybody healthy, I guess.
As it were, agriculture is threatened at the moment. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions that we can take from the audience. And if you haven't provided any decent questions, I will just override you. But I have to be given them.
I think you have to write them down and give them to the person who...
No, I think
or that has been going on.
Let's see. There we go. Thank you very much, Olivia. Terrific. Thank you. Right. No, just teasing. How did you think, this is for you, Edwin, how did you think about 20th century fiction as a global phenomenon?
Well, it was a defining aspect of the book, or the whole endeavor, which is that what struck me was when I was first thinking about doing it, I was thinking at first, no, it can't be done, because we think of fiction, we think of literature in terms of languages. There's French literature, and then, of course, that is the nature of academic departments. But it isn't, of course, the nature of how we read. We read across those boundaries, albeit, I mean, everybody deplores, and rightly continues to deplore, the imperviousness of the Anglosphere to so much of what is out there in the rest of the world. And indeed, a chapter that sort of fell by the wayside was a chapter about Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant, and surrealism in the novel. And part of the view was, well, surrealism has no significant effect on the novel, to which one wanted to say, where do you think magic realism came from exactly? And no, I mean, a basic dynamic going on behind the book, and along with what I said about the industrial nature of the novel, is that with the industrial nature of the novel, new markets open here, there, and yonder. Works are translated, works are partly translated. I mean, initially in Japan, in the Meiji, the Japanese are interested in what makes England such a success, the UK such a success globally.
Right.
And Donald Keene recounts in his great history of Japanese literature, recounts how astonishment at the fact that Disraeli had written a love story meant that people would have to start translating these because the English Prime Minister had done it, so it must be something that was worthy of consideration in this larger endeavor of making Japan a world-class nation. So, I mean, one of the points made is that the 20th century novel is much more than the 19th century novel, though even in the 19th century, Dostoevsky imprisoned is reading Jane Eyre in translation in a Russian thick magazine. So the dynamic has been there from the start,
Yes.
But it picks up in the 20th century, and indeed the 20th century novel is an essentially global construction.
Yeah, I mean, whereas Dostoevsky had to rely on translations, Tolstoy, I think, was able to read French and English.
Dostoevsky read French too.
Did he?
He first wanted to be a translator of. He did a translation of Eugénie Grandet. And it's because he couldn't make any money as a translator. He decided he would become a novelist. I think that may be an apocryphal tale.
And then War and Peace gets translated into French.
Yeah.
And Flaubert reads it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, French becomes the relay language for so many of these things. Yeah. But
We have a second question. Do you think the bifurcation of the novel as high art form and the novel as mass commodity has ultimately been good for the form? Feel free to answer as a publisher or a critic.
I think it is. I mean, it is certainly one of the arguments I make, that it is a defining feature of the novel of the last century, that genre, I mean, I write right after writing about Dostoevsky, I write about H.G. Wells, who is a formidable figure in the history of the 20th century, and when it comes to especially science fiction, a decisive figure, and one who I basically parallel to André Gide, who is very much a high novelist, but that notion of the art novel is also a kind of genre novel that is a product, really, of the last century.
Yeah.
An interesting tension exists between those two, and a lot of art novelists begin to plunder genre novelists, and genre novelists certainly have their ideas of things to take over from art novels, though that actually works in a slightly different way from the other way. I mean, you take a novel, you've written about a good deal, Blood Meridian, which is at some level, I mean, both a high art novel, but also a genre novel, a gory and slasher. And so, I mean, I think it's...
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting tension,
and
an interesting tension, and I would be sad if that tension had not emerged. At a certain level, the Hegelian part of me would say it was sure to emerge, no matter what. I mean, it would kind of,
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Cormac McCarthy, because yes, Blood Meridian and then The Road, that clearly dips into filmic stuff, but also genre fiction, zombie, whatever. But not written in zombie language, as it were, written in high.
Right.
I don't know what zombie language would be, but for sure, Cormac McCarthy did not write zombie English. What literary trends do you see occurring with novels today that you think will underscore 21st century novels in the future?
Well, I may turn that one over to you. One of the functions of my writing this book is and also doing the editing that I do, is that I actually am not deeply versed in the contemporary novel.
Well, as I say, you're publishing some really great contemporary novels. Well, again, reading your book and thinking about Lawrence, reading your book made me think. It made me a little bit melancholy, actually, because it's not. I was thinking like this. It's not what forms, what trends, what themes, and so on are going to. I don't know any better than anyone else what's next, if that's even a sensible way to think about it. It's that it does seem difficult to envisage a sensibility and creature like Lawrence existing in our contemporary age. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. With that utter free restlessness and passion that he had. Mm-hmm. That he's the forms are they're bent round his endless questing. Mm-hmm. And you know, even a pretty great and wild character like Cormac McCarthy isn't Lawrence exactly. Mm-hmm.
No, there is that passion and that sense that the desire for things to come together and the desire and the willingness to tear them apart, even when it's and right. keep looking and asking, which is then sort of also almost synaptic, a kind of synaptic intelligence of seeing the world around and so on. And it is difficult, and it's partly, I suppose, because this would be the flip side of the previous question about the mixing and mingling of genres, that once you get too rigid a sense of this kind of book and that kind of book, and let's put this spice in that mix, which to have that effect, a certain sense of just invention and discovery tends to...
Yes.
I mean, I have been thinking recently in the aftermath of, well, not in the just in the aftermath of the election, I've been thinking for a while, you know, I mean, in a way, the thing that I would love to see is something older, which is, we were talking about the Victorian novel before and talking about balance and so on. But actually, I reread a lot of Dickens in the aftermath of finishing this book, and that is a bit of a travesty of Dickens, who exists in a world which is both as interior as it is exterior.
Yeah.
Dickens is a certain... the old joke about Victor Hugo was a madman who thought he was Victor Hugo, is sort of true about Charles Dickens, too, that he was... but, I mean, it is a kind of... It seems incredibly realistic, except characters are kind of automata. It's a sort of... But he has a willingness to deal with human beings from every stratum of society and a kind of immediate imaginative investment in characters he despises as well as characters he's interested in. And in fact, usually the narrator characters like Copperfield are oddly blurred and kind of indefinite people who... So it's that sense of the extremeness of the larger world, which would almost fit in what I end up saying about the next century, which seems to be very much present in Dickens. But the wholeness of the picture and the sociological wholeness is something I think it would be tonic if a novelist tried to today tried to take that.
I was thinking about it actually. I was thinking about that earlier today when the news came about the. About Luigi Mangion, which is very sad, I think. Very symptomatic and very sad. Like, we could tell from the photographs that he was young, but I bet none of us thought he was 26 years old. Mm-hmm. And I bet none of us thought he had the educational formation he did. Mm-hmm. So then the novelist's question would be, and you could imagine a really tremendous novel that dealt with that. Not him, but, is right? We all understand anti-capitalism, but we don't understand shooting someone down in the street, right? I think. So well, maybe, but, Dostoevsky asked that question.
Yeah.
Like, what's the thing that goes wrong in a way, in the mind of someone like that he goes from a manifesto to murder? And I would say, one thing that surprised me in a way since 9/11, I thought after 9/11 that the novel would really get interested in radicalization, in the process of radicalization, because, and by and large, with a few exceptions, there was an excellent novel a few years ago by John Ray, but it, by and large, hasn't really dealt with that. And yet something about the intersection of sort of radicalization and I think depression or madness. It seems such a symptomatic and contemporary story that I'm eager for a great novelist to examine it properly. It's hard to know. Autofiction, I suppose, has certainly produced. I mean, I think in Annie Ernaux's The Years has produced a great novel, but maybe it's beginning to have had its day. I don't know.
I haven't read that book.
And the final one, this is very good. Have you found that your age as a reader affects the way you read novels?
Yes, I mean, inevitably. So, I mean, there's the, been there, done that aspect of things, and then there is, I mean, I also think there's the sort of, there's the struggle, which is an interesting struggle with any art form, to take an interest in the experience of people who are younger than you and to see why it matters so much. You can, looking at it from the outside, well, I mean, the young and the old get to condescend to each other mutually. But anyway, otherwise, I mean, there is the sheer pleasure of going back to books you've read before and finding that those books are just as live as they ever were, and live in different ways too. And a great deal of, I mean, the fun part of this project was not the writing. Writing is never fun, but was the reading of the first 2 or 3 years, where I for a while had that happy feeling of being under the covers with a flashlight or whatever. That, that this was an absolutely absorbing object, and the question of the world, of what it meant that there were such objects in the world, was unspeakably interesting.
That's a wonderful place to end. Thank you, Edwin.
Yeah, thank you.